So in Mark chapter 2 and verse 23, now it happened as they went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and as they went, his disciples began to pluck the heads of grain. And the Pharisees said to him, "Look, why do they do what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" But he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he was in need and hungry, he and those with him? How he went into the house of God in the days of Abiathar, the high priest, and ate the showbread, which is not lawful to eat, except for the priest, and also gave some to those who were with him. And when he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore, the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath." First of all, we would want to point out that what the apostles were doing was allowed. This was not something that he's actually breaking the law. In fact, turn over to Deuteronomy chapter 23 and verse 25. In Deuteronomy chapter 23, and we read in verse 25, "When you come into your neighbor's standing grain, you may pluck the heads with your hand, but you shall not use a sickle on your neighbor's standing grain." In other words, if you're walking by and there's some grain there that's growing, you can take it and rub it in your hands, blow away the chaff, and eat some. But don't go harvest your neighbor's crop. You are not allowed to do that. So you can go and have a meal with someone, but don't go clean out their cupboard. As we teenagers used to do to those who would say, "Yeah, just go help yourself in the kitchen." And boy, did we. So they are not breaking any kind of law here. And they're not certainly working on the Sabbath as being accused of. In verse 24, and the Pharisees said to him, "Look, why do they do what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And so they're really being accused of working on the Sabbath by just going by and pulling off the heads of some of the grain and getting rid of the chaff and eating that grain. Jesus, knowing this, wants to address what is actually transpiring. He knows their hearts. He knows their intent. And so he's going to bring to their remembrance something that happened in which you really want to say was unlawful. It truly was. And that was David eating the showbread. So turn over to 1 Samuel chapter 21. And in 1 Samuel chapter 21, we won't read all of the context, but David is running for his life from King Saul. And he has some men who are with him, and obviously they are hungry. Now, David lies on this occasion, but that wouldn't be justified by God, but what Jesus is bringing up is the fact that he ate this showbread. And so let's go ahead and read the context. In 1 Samuel chapter 21 and verse 1, "Now David came to Nob and Ahimelech the priest. And Ahimelech was afraid when he met David and said to him, 'Why are you alone and no one is with you?'" Now it would seem that the men are kind of waiting back, you might say. It says Ahimelech there, whereas in verse 26 of Mark 2, it says Abiathar, the high priest. And there is a distinction made between the two. So if you are kind of wondering, wait a minute, these names don't match up. We have Abiathar, the high priest, which was the father to Ahimelech, who is just a priest. So that's just a little tidbit there in case there was some confusion. In verse 2 of 1 Samuel chapter 21, "So David said to Ahimelech the priest, 'The king has ordered me on some business and said to me, do not let anyone know anything about the business on which I send you or what I have commanded you. And I have directed my young men to such and such a place. In other words, David is saying, don't ask me any questions about this. I'm doing what I'm having to do by orders of the king. Now, therefore, what have you on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread in my hand, or whatever you can find, or what can be found. And the priest answered David and said, there is no common bread on hand, but there is holy bread. If the young men have at least kept themselves from women. And this seems to be, a way of not just wanting to give it to them, at least it's going to be based upon some conditions. Then David answered the priest and said to him, truly women have been kept from us about 3 days since I came out, and the vessels of the young men are holy, and the bread is in effect common, even though it was sanctified in the vessel this day. In other words, it can be used for this purpose. So the priest gave him holy bread. This is the show bread. For there was no bread there but the show bread, which had been taken from before the Lord, in order to put hot bread in its place on the day when it was taken away. And so that'll be enough of that reading in that context for us to understand that we know that the showbread was intended for the priest and the priests only. David was not a priest. He had been anointed, but he hadn't even become king. But nevertheless, it doesn't matter. He is not allowed to eat this bread. And so Jesus brings this occasion up to their remembrance. Going back to our context in Mark chapter 2 and verse 25, but he said to them, have you never read what David did when he was in need and hungry, he and those with him, how he went into the house of God in the days of Abiathar, the high priest, and ate the showbread, which is not lawful to eat except for the priest, and also gave some to those who were with him. And so, what is Jesus pointing out? This context is pointing out mercy. And they should have gotten it. They should have understood that that life is worth more than what this bread was intended for, if you will. And so we'll see over in Matthew's account. If you will, follow with me over to Matthew chapter 12. And of course, it's always beneficial to look at all the accounts. This is also found in Luke chapter 6, verses 1 through 5. But in Matthew chapter 12, and if we begin reading in verse 1, same occasion, just the rendering of Matthew, he makes a point down in verse 7. And so let's just focus our attention on verse 7. But if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. And there's the title of our lesson. So they were guilty of not showing mercy. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. Does that mean that God didn't require sacrifice? No. But this is one of those, what we kind of call a not but. What's more important? It's more important to show mercy than it would be to let David and his men go starving themselves. Now, he goes on to say something else. Here in our context, in Matthew 12 and verse 8, since you are there, notice in verse 6, though, he says, but I say to you that in this place there is one greater than the temple. And then in verse 8, for the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. It would seem that Jesus is expressing that he can trump the Sabbath and he can use it for his purpose. But they had really turned it backwards. And so we'll seize this opportunity to make a point that the Sabbath was not to be a burden to the people of God. In fact, it was, rather than a burden, it was to be a rest. It was to help them. It wasn't to constrict them or confine them or hold them back. It was a day in which they should rest from their labor, just as God had rested from His. And there's going to be times that I'm going to choose to go outside of the context, and there's going to be times that I'm going to choose not to because I want to get through this particular lesson. And so we won't go into any great detail, but if you'll go back to Mark chapter 2 and notice what Jesus says in verse 27. The Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. They weren't made for the law. The law was for their benefit. The specific law stated here, of course, is the Sabbath, to keep the Sabbath, to keep it holy. And I would hope that we would never, ever view worshiping unto God on the first day of the week as a burden. It would seem that there are those who count it as a burden to worship. Now, I can understand that there can be some very boring preaching. I've sat through some boring preaching, and some of that was my own. Even though there is a difference of standing up here and sitting in that pew, absolutely understand that. I've done both. But the day that we find worshiping God, praying to Him, singing unto Him, and in the process teaching and admonishing one another, and partaking of the Lord's Supper on the first day of the week, and studying His Word, when that becomes a burden, you're in the wrong place. Or you got the wrong heart. Period. End of discussion. So if it is a burden and we're watching our clock and we've got to get out of here to beat the so-and-sos to lunch and that kind of mentality, you don't understand what worship is all about. This should be a time of refreshing, a time in which we are to focus our attention on God, upon our Savior. And for the Sabbath for them was a holy day in that sense, that they would do no work and that they would go and make the sacrifices and so on. And that wasn't a burden. It was a privilege. It was an honor. And it should be for us. If we find ourselves moaning and groaning about how long services is, then take a good look at some of the non-denominational places of worship. And how the preacher today, in our day and age, will sometimes preach an hour and a half. We're not talking about 60 years ago. And reconsider our attitude in regard to the Lord's Day, the first day of the week. But Jesus' main point here is that mercy needed to be shown to David on this occasion, and that the keeping of the law, and that is that this showbread is only intended for the priest, therefore you can starve to death, would be ungodly. And so the Sabbath was made for man, not man to be restricted to keep the law of the Sabbath, but that it was intended as a rest, a time to worship God, to focus their attention on Him. And therefore the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath. It really does seem as though Jesus is saying, I can do whatever I want. He didn't see any fault, and he would have condemned His apostles if they would have found any fault, or if He would have found fault in them. So continuing this same thought is certainly about the Sabbath. It brings us to Mark chapter 3, verses 1 through 5. And he entered the synagogue again, and a man there was, and he entered the synagogue again, and a man was there who had a withered hand. And they watched him closely, whether he would heal him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. Then he said to the man who had the withered hand, "Step forward." And he said to them, "Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill?" But they kept silent. So when he had looked around at them with anger, being grieved by the hardness of their hearts, he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored as whole as the other. So we have him entering into the synagogue, and there is a man there who has a withered hand. This is an opportunity for Jesus to do a healing, and it is obviously in front of his critics. It's in front of those who are going to find fault. It's in front of those who are going to be in opposition to him. We'll see how great an opposition in verse 6. And so what did they do? They watched him closely. And there's only one reason why they're wanting to watch him so closely. It's to see if he's going to work on the Sabbath, if he's going to heal, if he's going to do some kind of work, we might say. And I find it very interesting here that as they watched him closely, whether he would heal him on the Sabbath, so that they could accuse him, they're going to jump all over him. They're going to find fault. They're going to say, "See, you are a false prophet. You are not from God." And of course, they've elevated the Sabbath over everything else, it would seem, this idea of breaking the Sabbath. We already see that it is above mercy in their minds. Jesus corrects them and gives them the example of David. And in this circumstance, it is a man with the withered hand. There is certainly more given to us, as we will turn here in just a moment to Matthew's account. But I do want you to notice how Jesus responds to this. So he obviously knows what they are thinking. And in verse 3, he said to the man who had the withered hand, "Step forward." And now you can almost sense that these individuals are going, "All right, here it goes. We got him. He's going to do it." Can you see the irony of that? That here is a man who is capable of doing what only God can do. Now, we're not talking about some of these miracles that you see on TV from time to time, these miracle workers who bring someone up on the stage, and maybe they're in a wheelchair, and maybe they have some kind of ailment, but typically it's internal. It's a back problem. It's knee problem. It's something. It's not the obvious. In fact, the obvious is carted off somewhere else. They'll never make it on the stage. The person who has Lou Gehrig's disease. The paralytic, I can never say it right. Paralytic, anyways, the lame man. I can say lame. The paralytic. It's not going to be the obvious. But you see, that's what Jesus did over and over. We've already considered the paralytic who is let through the roof. It's obvious. And if we were to go to Acts chapter 4, and the man who's laid at the temple gate, the gate beautiful, I believe it is, he is one of those who it was obvious. Everyone knew. And so it is with this man with the withered hand. They know he has a withered hand. And all they're wanting to do is to see Jesus heal him so they can accuse him of working on the Sabbath. They're completely blind to the fact that Jesus is able to heal the man. And all they can do is find fault. We will come across this concept again and we will dig a little bit deeper, but I want to keep moving in this lesson and not elaborate any more about this concept of what Jesus was capable of doing, because we're going to have some other miracles to deal with as we go through our text. And so let's deal with the context here. And what does Jesus say in verse 4? Because this is very unique. Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil? Now, we already know that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And so what Jesus is really expressing is, can you do anything on the Sabbath, or are you to remain just a lump on the log? Just to be there. Secondly, to save life or to kill. And of course, they're going to keep silent. They don't have an answer for that. And what is Jesus' response in verse 5? So when he had looked around at them with anger. Why would he be angry? Would it not be that they have corrupted the Sabbath for what it was intended? And that the Sabbath was not a day in which you just did nothing. It's not that you went and did anything bad, or that you certainly couldn't work, right? We understand that. But can you not do anything good? Do you just sit in your chair and that's it? Nothing on the Sabbath. So Jesus is between a hard place and a rock, because if he doesn't do anything, he's not helping this individual. But if he does heal him on the Sabbath, now he's working. You see the irony? He can't win for losing. He's between a hard place and a rock. And their mentality angers him. These are the religious elite. You'll hear me say it over and over. These are the pious. These are the religious leaders. And so he's angry. But then it's coupled with being grieved by the hardness of their hearts. So he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." The answer is in the miracle itself. Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil? To save life or to kill? It is lawful to do good. It is lawful to save life. And by doing anything else, it would be wrong. He stretched out his hand, and his hand was restored as the whole as the other. Now let's turn over to Matthew chapter 12. In Matthew's account, we're given just a little bit more information. In Matthew chapter 12, beginning in verse 9. Now when he had departed from there, he went into their synagogue. And behold, there was a man who had a withered hand, and they asked him, saying, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" that they might accuse him. Then he said to them, "What man is there among you who has one sheep, and if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not lay hold of it and lift it out? Are you to just walk away? Would you be wrong in letting this animal die? Are you wrong in helping the animal by working and digging him out and getting him out of the ditch?" This coincides, of course, with what we just read over in Mark's account in verse 12 of how much more value then is a man than a sheep. You would help the sheep, this dumb animal. Whether it's worthy to be sacrificed or not is really irrelevant. Whether it's blind or lame, the idea is that if something's in need, you help. And it's lawful. Even to do that on the Sabbath. In other words, you're guilty. You've done this. You've helped someone on the Sabbath. You didn't count it as work because you saw the benefit in it of yourself. The idea is that it would be their lamb. And if they didn't help the lamb, it'd cost them. And if you want to get to someone, just hit their pocketbook. It was the same for people back then. Of how much more value then is a man than a sheep? Therefore it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Then he said to the man, stretch out your hand. And he stretched it out, and it was restored as whole as the other. A little bit different take on the same occasion. We see that what is emphasized by Matthew on this occasion is that you're condemning me for what you would do yourself, but you would do it for something least valuable than this individual. But you just can't wait till I'm going to heal him so you can find fault, and you miss the whole point that he's being healed because he has a need. And you can help. You got the Sabbath all wrong. It's a day of rest. It's for you, not to restrict you. It's not a day in which you just do nothing. It's a day in which you can help others and not just be the lump on the log. Certainly not to do evil. We're not justifying evil. We're just making a comparison of the two. Notice over in Luke chapter 6. Luke chapter 6 and verse 11. We read there, but they were filled with rage and discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. And then we see here in our context in verse 6, in Mark chapter 3 and verse 6, you'd think that they would wake up, that they would start putting the pieces together, that they would understand that we need to show mercy and we need to do good on the Sabbath. It's not just meant to do nothing. But we see their response. Then the Pharisees went out and immediately plotted with the Herodians against him, how they might destroy him. So the Herodians are those who are Hellenistic. They are Jews who speak Greek, and they've also taken on themselves, if you will, the Greek culture. They live as Greeks, but they are Jews. Now, I want you to remember that back in Mark chapter 2 and verse 18, the disciples of John and of the Pharisees were fasting. And it seemed like they get in cahoots with one another, you might say, and find fault in the fact that Jesus and his disciples. And now you have the Jews, or these Pharisees, whoever is here, most likely Pharisees, although we're not told specifically if there's another day that begins here in verse 1 of chapter 3. But if we back up, we see in verse 24, and the Pharisees said to him, look, and so on. Plotting with the Herodians. That would not be normal. So you have these very religious elite that put themselves in a category all to themselves, if you will, and are going to look down on everybody else. But now they're looking at those who they would normally not associate with, and they start plotting with them to find fault in Jesus. We could spend an hour on that easy. I want you to consider that this is just the beginning of Jesus' ministry in which they are seeking his life. So we're just going to go through these verses very, very quickly. John chapter 11 and verse 53. John 11 and verse 53. Then from that day on, they plotted to put him to death. Of course, that's Jesus. And then we would see in John chapter 5 and verse 16. In John chapter 5 and verse 16, we read there, for this reason the Jews persecuted Jesus and sought to kill him, because he had done these things on the Sabbath. And it's another healing. This is the, I won't take the time. So John chapter 8, and we see in verse 59, John 8 and verse 59, this is after he has stated, I am. which would go back to Moses and the bush, the burning bush. Then they took up stones to throw at him, but Jesus led himself away out of the temple, going through the midst of them and passing by. In John chapter 10 and verse 31, in verse 31, then the Jews took up stones again to stone him. And we would see in Luke chapter 4 and verse 28, in Luke chapter 4 and verse 28, there we read, then all those in the synagogue, when they heard these things, were filled with wrath and rose up and thrust him out of the city. And they led him to the brow of the hill on which their city was built. So a cliff, as it says at the end of the verse, that they might throw him down over the cliff. But we'll see in Mark, as we go through in Mark chapter 12 and verse 12, and they sought to lay hold of him, but feared the multitude, for they knew he had spoken the parable against them. So he left them and went away. And this is the parable of the vineyard owner, and how the vine dressers, it's harvest time, and the master, the owner of the vineyard, sins to get his money, in essence, and they kill him, beat him, and he sends his son, and so on. And so we'll come to that soon enough. In chapter 11, in Mark chapter 11, I'd like to read verse 18. Mark chapter 11 and verse 18. And the scribes and the chief priests heard it and sought how they might destroy him, for they feared him, because all the people were astonished at his teaching. They are certainly also astonished, as we've already seen thus far, and we'll see even more, that he has already gathered many people unto himself, if you will. We see in Mark chapter 1 and verse 28, immediately his fame spread throughout all the region around Galilee. In Mark 2 and verse 2, immediately many gathered so that there was no longer room to receive them, not even near the door, and he preached the word to them. And so Jesus is doing much healing. And it is to draw attention not to himself, but to the word in which he's preaching. The sad part is that they do not recognize Jesus for who he is. All they can see is that he's violating the law by plucking some grain as they walked by the field, working on the Sabbath, and then healing on the Sabbath. Can we be guilty ourselves? Can we be so set, if you will, in a law that it takes precedence over mercy? It takes precedence over helping someone else. And so these are times that remind us how we should put ourselves in check. And where is our heart? Toward God and toward our fellow man. And certainly we should not be those who want to be against Jesus, to kick against the goads. It should also be eye-opening there in verse 5 of chapter 3 that this angered the Lord and how they responded to him. It grieved him, but it was because of the hardness of their hearts. Who around you? Who around us needs our help? May they not be overlooked. May we not find ourselves in some other activity that even godly in nature in that sense, that would keep us from reaching out to them and giving them the compassion that they are in need of. The lesson is yours. Hopefully, it spurs you to look deeper into God's Word. As I said, there's much that we could dive into in all of this text, but I try to keep it as reasonable length and to get through Mark in the reasonable time of a year or so. And so, may we be a people who don't use the law against ourselves or against God, but to see that He desires mercy rather than sacrifice. And that is, and also to do good and not to do evil, but to be somewhere in the middle and do nothing is not justified either.